You've got 5 seconds to explain why you're on this deck before I have you escorted off in cuffs. The voice cut clean through the ocean wind, sharp and controlled, carrying the weight of authority that didn't need to shout to be heard, and yet it was the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience, the kind that had never once been questioned. Chief Ryan Cole stood squared off on the steel-gray flight deck, boots planted firm against the subtle sway of the carrier, his gloved hand gripping the old man's arm just tight enough to make a point without breaking protocol, while 2 other SEALs flanked them, silent, watchful, ready to act if needed. The sea stretched out in every direction, endless blue broken only by the white churn of the ship's wake, and above it all the steady hum of rotor blades from a distant hello bled into the air like a low warning that never stopped. The old man didn't resist. He didn't pull away, didn't argue, didn't even look at the men surrounding him. Instead, Arthur Hayes stood there with the kind of stillness that didn't belong on a warship, his weather jacket shifting slightly in the wind, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon as if the entire scene unfolding around him was nothing more than background noise. That, more than anything, unsettled Cole. Civilians panicked. Trespassers made excuses. Even seasoned contractors tried to explain themselves. But this man did none of it. "You deaf, old-timer?" Cole pressed, his tone tightening just enough to show irritation creeping in. "This is a restricted deck. You don't just wander up here like it's a Sunday pier." One of the younger SEALs let out a quiet chuckle, shifting his stance as he glanced at the old man's worn boots and faded clothing, clearly out of place among the sharp lines of uniforms and precision gear. The contrast was almost insulting. This was a billion-dollar vessel, a floating fortress of steel and discipline, and here stood a man who looked like he belonged in a hardware store parking lot, not on the flight deck of a U.S. Navy carrier somewhere in the Pacific. Arthur finally blinked, slow and deliberate, as if returning from a place far away, but even. Then he didn't look at Cole right away. His gaze drifted briefly across the deck, tracing the lines of parked aircraft, the placement of equipment, the movement of crew members in the distance, and there was something in the way he observed it all that didn't match confusion. It looked familiar. Too familiar. Cole noticed it, and for a fraction of a second, something didn't sit right. Then the feeling passed, replaced by the certainty of rank and role. "I asked you a question," he said, firmer now, pulling slightly on the man's arm to force eye contact. Arthur's eyes met his at last, pale blue and steady, carrying a depth that didn't flinch under pressure, didn't react to the grip, didn't acknowledge the authority being imposed on him. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough with age, but clear. "I was told to be here." The words landed without urgency, without defense, just a simple statement placed into the wind as if it didn't need to be believed to be true. One of the SEALs scoffed. "Yeah. And who told you that?" Cole asked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth now, the situation tipping from procedure into something closer to amusement. Arthur didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted again, not away, but through, like he was looking past the present moment into something older, something deeper. The hum of the ship, the distant calls of deck crew, the rhythmic crash of waves against steel, it all seemed to fade around him for just a second. Then he said quietly, "Someone who knows this ship better than you think." That did it. The smirk hardened into something colder. Cole gave a short nod to his team, tightening his grip just a fraction. "All right," he said, voice flattening into command again. "We're done playing this game." Around them, a few sailors had begun to slow their pace, subtle glances turning into quiet observation. Not a crowd, not yet, but enough for the tension to take shape, to stretch across the deck like a wire pulled too tight. And still, Arthur Hayes didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't explain. He just stood there, steady against the wind, like he had already seen how this moment would end, and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the sharp scent of jet fuel across the deck as a crew chief signaled in the distance, his fluorescent vest catching the sun in brief flashes, but closer in, the air around Arthur Hayes felt strangely still, as if the noise of the carrier itself refused to fully reach him, And that quiet only seemed to tighten the tension building in Chief Ryan Cole's chest, because nothing about this man fit the situation anymore, not the calm, not the lack of urgency, not the way he stood like he belonged in a place where even seasoned sailors felt the weight of constant motion beneath their boots. "You think this is a joke?" Cole said, his voice lower now, less for show and more for control, while one of his men stepped around behind Arthur, checking his pockets with quick, efficient movements that came up empty except for something small and metallic clipped near the seam of his jacket. "Chief, you are going to want to see this," the SEAL said, holding up a dull, weathered piece of metal no larger than a matchbook, its surface scratched, edges worn smooth by time. It did not shine, did not carry any of the polished authority of modern insignia, and yet it looked deliberate, placed there with care rather than forgotten. Cole reached for it, turning it between his fingers with a faint frown. "What is this supposed to be, some kind of old access tag?" he muttered, glancing back at Arthur, who simply watched him now, silent, patient, as if the answer did not need to be given. Around them the subtle movement on the deck slowed even more. A pair of sailors paused near a tow tractor, their conversation dying mid-sentence as they looked over, drawn not by noise but by something harder to explain, a shift in the air that people felt before they understood. Cole scoffed softly and flicked the edge of the metal piece with his thumb. "This does not get you clearance on my deck," he said, handing it back to his teammate without another thought, but Arthur's gaze lingered on that small object for a fraction longer than before, and for the briefest second, the sound of the carrier seemed to blur, replaced by something older, the echo of wind. Across open water, the hollow clang of steel from a different time, a different deck, one without digital panels or automated systems, where orders were shouted over raw engine noise and every man knew the ship by memory, not by screen. The image came and went like a passing shadow, leaving nothing behind except the same quiet expression on his face. Ensign Daniel Brooks stood 10 yards away, tablet in hand, frozen halfway through a routine systems check he had forgotten the moment he noticed the object. He could not place it at first, the design too simple, too crude compared to the standardized identifiers he had trained with, but something about it scratched at the back of his mind, something from an old briefing, or a footnote in a naval archive he had skimmed late at night when he could not sleep, something tied to a designation that no longer existed. Brooks swallowed, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "Careful not to draw attention, sir," he said quietly toward Cole, but his voice did not carry the usual confidence of rank, it carried hesitation, uncertainty. "That tag. I think I have seen something like that before." Cole did not look at him, his attention still fixed on Arthur. "Then you can explain it after we clear this man off my deck," he replied flatly, but Brooks did not move, his thumb hovering over his tablet as he quickly pulled up a restricted archive channel, the kind that required more curiosity than clearance to even attempt. The screen loaded slowly, too slowly for the pace of everything else happening, and yet in that delay, the weight of the moment seemed to deepen. Arthur Hayes shifted his stance just slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, but enough for the sunlight to catch his face at a different angle, revealing lines carved by decades, not just of age, but of something lived through, something carried, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and for the first time since this started, Brooks felt it clearly, not confusion, not curiosity, but the unmistakable sense that they were standing on the edge of a mistake already too far gone, and somewhere above them, deep within the command structure of the ship, a message was about to be sent that would change everything. Ensign Daniel Brooks felt the weight of the tablet in his hands grow heavier with every passing second as the loading icon spun, slow and indifferent, while the world around him seemed to move at a completely different speed, voices muffled, footsteps distant, the steady thrum of the carrier beneath his boots fading into something background and unimportant, because now all his focus narrowed to a single line of data trying to surface from a system not designed to be accessed casually, and when it finally did, it did not arrive with clarity, it arrived fragmented, incomplete, like a memory pulled from deep water, a designation code first, outdated formatting, something that had not been used in decades, followed by a name that made his breath catch before he even fully processed it, Arthur Hayes. The letters staring back at him in stark contrast to the modern interface, and beneath that, a classification marker that should not have existed on a system like this, restricted, archived, partially sealed. Brooks swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as he scrolled, each line revealing less information than it should have. as if entire sections had been deliberately removed or buried under layers he could not access, but what remained was enough, more than enough, to make his pulse spike in a way no drill or emergency ever had. Because this was not confusion anymore, this was recognition trying to form. In real time, behind him Chief Ryan Cole's voice cut through again, sharper now, impatience turning into decision. "We are done here, get him off this deck," he ordered, already shifting his stance to move the situation forward, but Brooks did not move, his eyes still locked on the screen as a final line flickered into view, something tagged decades earlier, something tied to a naval operation that no longer appeared in any active training material, a ship designation that matched the one beneath his feet but with a version number that should have been impossible, older, original, and suddenly the pieces aligned in a way that sent a cold wave through him, his head lifting slowly as he looked back at the old man standing in the wind as if none of this mattered, as if time itself had not moved on without him. "Chief," Brooks said again, louder this time, his voice cutting through just enough to stall the moment, "I think you need to stop." The words hung there, unexpected, out of place coming from a junior officer addressing a SEAL team leader in the middle of an operation. Cole turned his head slightly, irritation flashing across his face. "Not now, Ensign," he replied flatly, but Brooks stepped forward anyway, breaking the invisible line that separated observer from participant. "Sir, that tag is not random," he said, holding up the tablet slightly though he knew Cole was not looking yet. "It is tied to an original deck access designation from before the refit, before the current command structure. It should not exist in any active database, but it does, and it is tied to him." That last word carried a weight that shifted the air in a way even the wind could not. One of the SEALs glanced at the tablet, then back at Arthur, uncertainty flickering for the first time where confidence had been. Cole's grip did not loosen, but it did not tighten either, caught between instinct and something he could not yet define. Arthur Hayes said nothing, his gaze steady, patient, as if he had watched this exact realization unfold before in different forms, different faces, across different years, and somewhere deep within the ship, far above the deck where the ocean stretched endless and indifferent, a communication channel opened that had not been used for routine matters in a very long time, a voice on the other end repeating a name slowly, carefully, as if confirming something that should not have needed confirmation at all. And back on the deck, Ensign Brooks felt the moment tilt, subtle but undeniable, like the first shift before a storm changes direction. Because whatever was about to happen next was no longer under the control of the men standing here high above the flight deck. Inside the controlled stillness of the carrier's command level, Admiral Jonathan Reeves stood at the center of a quiet briefing room, one hand resting lightly on the edge of a polished table as officers around him moved through a routine operational update, their voices steady, precise, filled with numbers, coordinates, and projected timelines that followed a rhythm he had heard thousands of times before, but today that rhythm broke in the smallest possible way when a communications officer hesitated mid-sentence, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that should not exist in a room trained for precision. "Sir," the officer said, adjusting his headset slightly as if confirming what he had just heard, "We have a flag-level inquiry coming through from the deck." Reeves did not look up immediately, his attention still fixed on the data in front of him. "What kind of inquiry?" he asked, calm, controlled, expecting something procedural, something routine. "It is a name confirmation request, sir," the officer replied, and there was something in his tone now, something restrained, as if he was not sure how to present what he was seeing. "Go ahead," Reeves said. His voice even, the room continuing its quiet movement around him, until the officer spoke again, slower this time, deliberate. "They are asking to verify an individual currently detained on deck. Name is Arthur Hayes." The sound of that name did not echo, it did not crash, it simply landed, and yet everything in the room seemed to shift around it, subtle but immediate, like the pressure in the air had changed without warning. Reeves' hands stopped moving, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough that the motion ceased entirely, his eyes lifting from the table to the officer with a focus that cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. "Repeat that," he said, not louder, but heavier, the kind of weight that made everyone else in the room instinctively still. The officer swallowed, glancing once at his screen before answering. "Arthur Hayes, sir." The confirmation settled deeper this time, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Reeves said nothing at all, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the officer, beyond the room, as if the present had stepped aside and allowed something older to take its place. The hum of the ship beneath them seemed distant now, replaced by a memory that did not belong to anyone else in that room, the feel of steel underfoot in a different era, the sharp taste of salt air mixed with something heavier, the echo of orders given without hesitation, and the image of a man standing where others could not, holding a line that was never meant to hold. Reeves blinked once, the present snapping back into place, but the shift had already happened. The room felt it even if they did not understand it. Where is he? Reeves asked, his voice returning, but not unchanged. There was something under it now, something controlled with effort rather than naturally held. Flight deck, sir, detained by SEAL personnel, the officer replied, and that was enough. Reeves straightened fully, the quiet authority in his posture sharpening into something immediate, something that required no explanation. Hold all current movement on that deck, he said, already turning toward the exit, his words cutting clean through any remaining activity in the room. No one touches him until I get there. There were no questions, no hesitation. Orders like that did not invite either, and as the Admiral stepped out into the corridor, the pace of everything around him shifted instantly, officers clearing the way, the low hum of routine replaced by a silent awareness that something far outside normal procedure had just been set into motion, and far below, on the open deck where wind and steel and ocean met, the moment that had begun as a simple misunderstanding was about to collide with something much older, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. The wind across the flight deck picked up just enough to ripple the loose edge of Arthur Hayes's jacket, the fabric shifting in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed completely out of sync with the tightening circle around him, because while the ship moved forward through open water at nearly 30 knots, this moment had slowed to something else entirely, something measured not in speed but in weight, and Chief Ryan Cole felt it even if he refused to name it, his jaw set, his stance unchanged, but his focus no longer as absolute as it had been minutes before, because now there was hesitation in the air, subtle, almost invisible, but present in the way one of his men shifted his footing, in the way another glanced briefly toward the island structure towering above them, as if expecting something to happen without knowing what. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, Cole said finally, his voice lower, controlled, directed more at the situation than the man in front of him. If you were told to be here, then you will confirm who told you, and we sort this out the right way. It sounded reasonable, procedural, the kind of statement that restored order, but Arthur Hayes did not respond immediately, his eyes drifting once more across the deck, tracing a path that did not follow the modern layout, but something older, something remembered rather than observed. His gaze pausing briefly near a section of reinforced plating that most would never notice, and for a moment the present thinned again, replaced by a memory not loud or dramatic, but precise, the echo of boots hitting that same steel decades earlier, the sharp call of a signal officer cutting through heavy wind, the vibration of engines that did not hum as smoothly as they did now, and the presence of men who understood that every second mattered in ways that could not be measured on a screen. Arthur blinked, the vision passing as quietly as it came, leaving him exactly where he stood, unchanged. I already told you, he said at last, his voice even, unforced. I was told to be here. There was no challenge in it, no defiance, just a statement repeated because it had not changed, and somehow that made it harder to dismiss. Cole exhaled slowly through his nose, turning his head slightly toward Ensign Brooks. You said you found something, he said, the words edged now with a demand for clarity, for something solid to ground this in. Brooks stepped closer, tablet still in hand, his earlier hesitation replaced by a focused urgency. Sir, the identification tag is not part of any current access system, he said, choosing each word carefully. It matches a classification used before the carrier's last full refit, possibly even earlier than that, and the name attached to it is flagged in a restricted archive with limited visibility. I cannot access the full record, but what is there suggests he was cleared at a level that does not appear in modern command structures. The explanation hung in the air, complex enough to disrupt the simple narrative they had been operating under. One of the SEALs frowned, glancing again at Arthur as if seeing him for the first time, not as a trespasser, but as a question. Cole's grip finally loosened, not completely, but enough to shift the balance, enough to show that certainty had been replaced by something else, something cautious, something calculating. That still does not explain why he is here now, Cole replied, though the firmness in his voice had changed, less absolute, more measured, as if he was already adjusting his position without admitting it. Arthur's eyes moved to him again, steady, calm, carrying that same quiet depth that had been there from the start. "No," he said softly, "it does not," and for a second longer than it should have, the two men held that moment between them, one grounded in present authority, the other in something that did not need to announce itself, and then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a shift so subtle it took a heartbeat to register. The activity across the deck began to slow in a way that was not natural, signals paused, movements redirected, conversations cut short mid-word, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the entire space and everyone felt it at once, a directive moving faster than sound, carried through channels that did not reach this level often. Cole's head turned instinctively toward the island, his instincts catching up before his mind did, because something had just changed, something above his authority, above procedure, something that did not send warnings, only outcomes, and in that quiet, tightening space, Arthur Hayes stood exactly as he had from the beginning. Unmoved, as if he had been waiting for this moment to arrive all along. The change did not come with noise, it did not arrive with alarms or shouted commands, it came the way real authority always did on a ship. Like this, quiet, absolute, and impossible to ignore, because one by one the small movements that kept the deck alive began to fade, a crewman lowering his signal paddle mid-gesture, a tow tractor idling without moving, a pair of sailors stopping in place as if an unseen hand had pressed pause on the world around them, and Chief Ryan Cole felt it settle across his shoulders before he ever heard the words. A shift that did not belong to him, that did not answer to him, and for the first time since this began, he did not give an order, he waited, his grip on Arthur Hayes now fully released, not out of concession but out of instinct, because something higher had entered the situation whether he wanted it to or not. "Deck control has issued a hold," one of his men said quietly, almost under his breath, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile line had just been drawn. Ensign Daniel Brooks lowered his tablet slowly, the glow of the screen no longer important now that the confirmation had already traveled where it needed to go, his eyes fixed toward the access point leading up toward the command structure, watching, waiting, the wind still moving across the open steel but the energy beneath it now completely different, no longer scattered, no longer routine, it had narrowed, focused, like a lens tightening before a shot is taken. Arthur Hayes stood at the center of it all, unchanged, the same steady posture, the same quiet presence, but now the space around him had shifted, widened in a way that was not physical but understood, a boundary forming without being marked, no one stepping closer than necessary, no one speaking directly to him anymore, and in that silence, something older seemed to settle in, something the ship itself recognized even if the men did not. Seconds stretched, long enough for doubt to take shape in places where certainty had been absolute. Cole's jaw tightened slightly as he glanced toward the island again, not impatient now, but aware, calculating, the situation no longer his to control, only his to respond to, and then it happened, not with a dramatic entrance, not with urgency, but with presence, a single figure stepping out onto the upper walkway, uniform precise, posture unyielding, the kind of presence that did not need introduction because it carried its own weight. Admiral Jonathan Reeves moved forward at a measured pace, not rushing, not hesitating, each step deliberate, controlled, the wind pulling slightly at his sleeves as he descended toward the deck, and below, every set of eyes shifted without being told, every conversation already gone silent, because there are moments on a ship where rank is not just seen, it is felt, and this was one of them. Cole straightened instinctively, not snapping into motion, but aligning himself with the gravity of what was approaching, his team following suit in subtle adjustments that spoke louder than any command. Brooks felt his pulse steady and sharpen at the same time, the uncertainty now replaced by the understanding that the moment he had triggered was about to resolve, and Arthur Hayes, for the first time since this began, moved, not stepping forward, not turning away, just a slight shift of his shoulders as his gaze lifted toward the approaching figure, calm, steady, as if he had known exactly who would come, and exactly how this would end. And when Admiral Reeves reached the final steps and set foot onto the flight deck, the distance between them closing not in urgency but in inevitability, the air itself seemed to tighten, because whatever was about to happen next would not need to be explained to be understood. Admiral Jonathan Reeves did not speak as he approached, and that silence carried more weight than any command that could have been given over the deck speakers. his step steady against the steel beneath him, each one measured, deliberate, the distance between him and the group closing slowly but with an inevitability that no one there could ignore, the wind tugging at his uniform but failing to disrupt the controlled precision of his movement. And as he came within 20 feet, something subtle but unmistakable happened. Chief Ryan Cole shifted first, not out of fear, not even fully out of respect, but out of recognition, the kind drilled into instinct, his posture straightening, his shoulders aligning, his team following. A half-second behind, the casual edge gone, replaced by a quiet readiness that mirrored the tone of the moment, Ensign Daniel Brooks stepped back slightly, not retreating, but clearing space without being told, his eyes moving between the Admiral and Arthur Hayes, understanding now that whatever he had uncovered was only a fraction of the truth, and at the center of it all, Arthur stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, unhurried, his gaze meeting the Admiral's without tension. Without expectation, just recognition, as if 2 points in time had finally aligned after years of distance. Reeves stopped a few feet away, close enough that the details became clear, the worn edges of the jacket, the faint lines carved into the man's face, the small metal tag that hung quietly where it had always been, and for a moment that stretched longer than anyone expected, the Admiral said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on Arthur Hayes as if confirming something that could not be read from a report or a system, something that existed only in memory, only in experience, and then it happened, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, the kind of shift that does not need explanation because everyone present feels it at once. Reeves exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and his posture changed in a way that no one there had ever seen before, not relaxed, not diminished, but altered, as if the weight he carried had just been placed in a different context. "Release him," he said. Quietly, the words directed not at Cole specifically, but at the space itself, and even though no one had been holding Arthur anymore, the command still landed, final, unquestioned. Cole stepped back fully now, the last trace of control leaving his stance, replaced by something far more careful, far more aware. "Sir," he began, the instinct to explain rising before he could stop it, but Reeves lifted a single hand, not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to halt the words before they formed. And the silence returned, heavier now, deeper, because this was no longer about procedure, it was about something else entirely, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The Admiral's eyes never left Arthur as he took one final step forward, closing the last of the distance between them, and for a heartbeat, the entire flight deck seemed to hold still, the ocean, the wind, the ship itself fading into the background of a moment that belonged to two men and the history that connected them. "You took your time," Arthur said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough familiarity to ripple through the stillness. And for the first time since stepping onto the deck, a faint change crossed Reeves' expression, not a smile, not quite, but something close, something that did not belong to rank or command, but to memory. "Traffic was heavy," Reeves replied, just as quietly, and in those few words, the distance of decades collapsed into something immediate, something present, and around them, the men who had moments ago controlled the situation now stood in complete silence, because without a single raised voice, without a single display of force, everything had already changed, and they all knew it. The silence that followed did not break, it deepened, settling across the flight deck like a weight no one dared disturb, because what had just passed between Admiral Jonathan Reeves and Arthur Hayes was not something written in manuals or taught in training, it was something earned, something remembered, and every man standing there felt the difference without needing it explained. Chief Ryan Cole held his position, but the certainty that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced now by a measured stillness, his eyes fixed forward, aware that anything he said or did in this moment would only echo his earlier mistake louder. Ensign Daniel Brooks stood a step behind, his tablet now lowered completely at his side, forgotten, because the truth he had chased through data was now standing in front of him in a form far more real than anything a system could display, and at the center of it all, Arthur Hayes shifted slightly, not to assert himself, not to step forward, but simply to exist within the space that had finally been given back to him, his gaze steady on Reeves. "You kept the old layout," Arthur said after a moment, his voice carrying just enough to reach. Without forcing its way through the quiet, Reeves gave a small nod, his eyes briefly scanning the deck as if seeing it through a different lens. "Not all of it," he replied, "but enough." The exchange was simple, almost casual, but it carried layers that stretched far beyond the present moment, layers built on years that none of the others could see. One of the seals shifted his weight again, the movement subtle but noticeable in the stillness. His earlier confidence replaced by something closer to restraint, because now the old man was no longer just a man out of place, he was someone the Admiral himself had stepped down to meet, and that changed everything. Reeves took a half-step closer, his attention returning fully to Arthur, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not belong to rank or authority, but to shared history. "We thought you were gone," Reeves said quietly, the words carrying a weight that did not belong on an open deck. Under a clear sky, Arthur's expression did not change much, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something distant, something measured. "A lot of things were," he answered, calm, steady, leaving the meaning open without needing to explain it. The wind moved again, stronger this time, pulling at loose fabric and carrying the low rumble of the ocean against the hull, and still no one else spoke. Because no one else knew how to enter a conversation like this, Cole finally moved, just a single step back, not retreating, but creating space, acknowledging without words that the moment no longer belonged to him. His team mirrored the motion instinctively, the tight formation loosening into something more respectful, more aware. Brooks watched it all unfold with a clarity that settled deeper with each passing second, the realization that this was not just a misunderstanding corrected, it was a revelation. The kind that reshaped how you saw everything that came before it. Reeves reached out then, not quickly, not with ceremony, just a simple motion to the front of Arthur's jacket where the worn metal tag still rested, his fingers adjusting it slightly, straightening it with a care that stood in sharp contrast to how it had been handled moments earlier, and that small gesture landed harder than any command could have, because it carried recognition, respect, and something more personal that no one dared name out loud. When Reeves withdrew his hand, he did not step back, he did not turn away, he simply stood there, squared, present, his posture aligning in a way that every man on that deck understood instantly. Because some actions are universal in the military, some signals cross every branch, every generation, every rank, and when Admiral Jonathan Reeves slowly raised his hand in a deliberate, measured salute, there was no command given, no order spoken, and yet across the flight deck, one by one, every man who saw it followed, the motion spreading in silence until the entire space stood still under the weight of it, and at the center of that moment, Arthur Hayes did not rush, did not react with surprise, he simply returned the salute with the same quiet precision he had carried from the beginning, and in that exchange, everything that needed to be said was already understood. The salute held for a moment that seemed longer than it should have, not because of protocol, but because of what it carried, and when it finally lowered, the motion was slow, deliberate, like setting something down with care rather than simply ending it. The wind moved again across the flight deck, filling the silence that followed, but the space itself had changed, not visibly, not in any way that could be measured, but in the way every man present now stood a little straighter, a little quieter, as if they had all just been reminded of something they had never been taught directly. Admiral Jonathan Reeves let his hand fall back to his side, his posture returning to its usual precision, but the edge of command that normally defined it remained softened, grounded by something older than rank. "You should have checked in," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough weight to reach Arthur without cutting through the air. Arthur Hayes gave a faint shift of his shoulders, not quite a shrug, but close enough. "I did," he replied simply, his tone unchanged, "just not through your system." There was the smallest hint of something there, not humor exactly, but familiarity, the kind that only comes from shared time rather than shared words. Reeves nodded once, accepting it without question, because whatever explanation existed did not need to be spoken here, not now. Around them the deck slowly began to breathe again, movement returning in careful increments. A signal officer resuming position, a crewman stepping back into motion, but the rhythm had changed. More measured, more aware, as if the moment had left a mark that would not fade quickly. Chief Ryan Cole stood where he was, the weight of what had happened settling in fully now, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, more reflective, and after a brief pause, he stepped forward, not abruptly, not with the authority he had carried before, but with a controlled respect that matched the tone of the moment. "Sir," he said, addressing Reeves first, then shifting his gaze to Arthur, "I was not aware." The words were simple, but they carried acknowledgement without excuse. Reeves did not respond immediately, his attention still on Arthur, as if allowing the moment to resolve on its own terms. Arthur looked at Cole then, really looked at him for the first time, not with judgment, not with challenge, just with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning. "You were doing your job," he said quietly, and that was all. No correction, no lesson delivered, just a statement that landed with more weight than anything else could have. Cole gave a small nod, accepting it in a way that settled something inside him, something that would likely stay long after this moment ended. Ensign Daniel Brooks exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his mind already replaying everything he had seen, everything he had almost missed, and understanding now that some things were not meant to be found in systems or files, some things were carried in people, in memory. In the quiet spaces between words, Reeves turned slightly then, glancing out across the open water for just a second before looking back. "Walk with me," he said to Arthur, the word simple, but carrying an invitation rather than a command. Arthur nodded once, stepping forward without hesitation, the two men moving side by side across the deck, not hurried, not drawing attention, but impossible to ignore all the same, and as they passed, the path ahead of them seemed to clear without direction, without instruction, because respect, once recognized, does not need to be enforced, it moves on its own. The wind caught the edge of Arthur's jacket again as they reached the far side of the deck, the ocean stretching endless beyond them, and for a brief moment, they both paused, not speaking, just standing there, looking out at the horizon where sky met water in a line that never changed, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many ships crossed it. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, they continued on, disappearing from the center of attention as quietly as the moment had begun, leaving behind a deck that looked the same as it always had, but felt different. In a way no one there would forget, because some things do not need to be explained to be understood, and some respect, once earned, does not fade with time, it waits, silent, until it is seen again.